It's a pleasure to be here, out east again. It makes us reflect on our time here because it was the location of our intellectual formation in many ways, and then on our post-collegiate migration to California and what that has done to us, as well it should, since the work that we're going to be talking about tonight is really the hybrid offspring of our East Coast education and the internalization and transformation of a certain kind of Californian sensibility. So we titled our lecture Loose for several reasons. First, somewhat ironically, because like so many architects, we must admit that we're highly controlling and obsessive and critical, but we have a combined fascination and horror and ultimately a belief in what our subconscious yields. The unconscious is exciting because it offers a bridge between the defensible regimes of control that we learn or are trained to be good at, and the release of control, which is the dream or the unknown. So paradoxically, this professional and dispositional difficulty in being loose has led us to explore and create various devices for unleashing the unconscious in design. So in some sense, the title refers also to a kind of post-lapsarian longing for creative freedom. Loose also reflects our West Coast regional influence, but maybe to a greater extent, a kind of fantasy that we would like to perpetuate about Californian culture. Formally, we are interested in producing gestures that appear casual, easy, and jaunty. One trick is how to make those gestures, and another is how to preserve and protect them throughout the slow-moving, deliberate process that is architecture. A third and related meaning of the title is that we're interested in making architecture that is capable of reflecting the current knowledge base, and thus it needs to be comfortable with that which cannot be clearly represented. Looseness in this context means being okay with what has been historically perceived as awkward or unclean or with messy relationships. The language of modernism doesn't allow us to talk about the inconsistency of complexity, or of non-uniform differentiated space, for example. Looseness, we think, offers a way in to the representation of uncertainty. Finally, looseness is a fundamental quality of what we believe to be a critical architecture of the future. It is certainly an idealized belief, but our goal is to carry into the built realm work that points away from conventional expectations of form, systems, and use. We wanted to expand the way people think and act. To this end, we try to direct our projects towards our two tenets of a critical practice: inconsistency and relaxation. So we're going to look at a range of projects under the umbrellas of those two themes. And many projects belong under both umbrellas, and the umbrellas themselves often merge into a kind of strange hourglass-shaped union, especially since they're both informed by an interest in chance and randomness and contingency. So I should warn you that we are going to introduce a little break, a release, if you will, in the middle of our themes to discuss some wanderings that we have made in the fields of chance. This little supplement, this little break, is critical to the whole enterprise because chance offers a type of freedom or looseness. Chance-driven or automatic processes are, among other things, an attempt to recover a kind of design wrist, if you're familiar with that expression from studio, in the face of our hypercritical and self-conscious superegos. Often we've found the worst controlling offender is oneself, and so we have become increasingly interested in design methods of freeing ourselves from ourselves, as it were. As a safeguard, we often try to introduce something inhuman into design to control these self-repressing tendencies, to control the controller, as it were. So staying on the right side of control is key, but we find that the right side flips back and forth. Many of our projects take their starting points looking at various systems of control that architects employ: architectural representation, efficiency, consistency, to name a prominent few. And then they attempt to subvert those controls. So in this vein, I'll begin with a somewhat scattered survey of the various forms of what we would like to think of as a critical inconsistency takes in our work. Irrationality. The Conway House is the project, and it imagines an alternative universe suffused with irrationality and entirely structured by a single space-filling tile, which is the Conway biprism. Unlike regular close packing, the space that is partitioned by this aperiodic tile is governed by an overall repetitive logic, but every incidence of the tile is unique and non-repeatable. The project is in many ways a critique of the ubiquitous universal Cartesian grid and an attempt to imagine alterity that is nevertheless within a totalizing system. The house is situated within a particular vision of universal space, one in which all space is full space, insofar it is exhaustively tiled or partitioned, but it is pervaded by inconsistency. Here's the basic unit of space. The Conway biprism tile has the special characteristic of being both space-filling and aperiodic. Each layer of the tiles rotates and accumulates at an irrational angle relative to the previous layer. The resulting formal system combines a relentless logic with a surprising volatility. Every tile is the same, yet as you can see as you drop down the chart, the specific relationship between waffles never repeats. So the biprisms in the project are necessarily embedded in infinitely distinct ways. We position the house in the immediate site at the intersection of 3 parallel layers of biprismatic tiles. Within each layer, the biprisms assemble in a regular pattern, like a waffle. But the successive stacking layers are forced to interlock with each other at non-repetitive angles. The space-filling qualities of the tile create a totalizing environment in which the house and the context are so inextricably linked and entangled as to make the distinction between them largely irrelevant. So this project and many others that we're going to talk about are distinctive for implying systems of thought that extend beyond the immediate object. So in order to design this project, which admittedly was a research project, we needed first to design a universe. And in some respect, the specific object is somewhat arbitrary manifestation that's only important insofar as it points towards a larger alternative system of thought. The house proper consists of 10 total biprisms, a 2x3 array on the lower level, and an inverted and rotated 2x2 array above. This is a section that shows the prototypical biprism, which is designed to provide a level ground plane throughout most of the main floor of the house. Because of the aperiodicity of the tiling system, this totally level condition will never again repeat in the entire universe, even with an infinite extension of waffles up and down. So you can understand from this section that the overall field of space throughout this universe is striated, but each layer privileges a local order. This is evidenced within the house, insofar as the point of reference shifts from level to level. And the house is a microcosm of non-uniform space in which local symmetries exist but are incorporated within a pervasive complexity. Warping. The project is Parallax, and it's a simple outdoor pavilion in the Sierra foothills, but it's also a virtual object that points towards a warped vision field. The project is very simple. It was really a way for us to spatialize some of the conventions of architectural representation, specifically perspective drawing. We began with the pure geometry of a box on the site and then placed 2 virtual vanishing points some distance away. These points warp the object, of course, but more provocatively, we think they warp the even space of the neutral Cartesian site grid with an implied vision field by pulling nearby lines out of parallel into convergence. The pavilion location on site is in the lower right quadrant of this territory. The mapping of these distortions is exciting to us because it starts to identify the kind of unthinkable space of infinite convergence. The resulting form of the pavilion has an inconsistent scale, subtly appearing slightly too large or too small depending on one's position in the site. The vanishing points that we set up pull the edges of the initial prism out of parallel and into convergence. This is interesting because it embeds the distortion of a pre-applied 2-point perspective onto the form, as if the neutral object is already being viewed in perspective. Viewed on site, the result is a formal changeableness that ranges from an extreme foreshortening to an elusive flattening. When you stand within the visual field of the first vanishing point, as in this photograph, rather than viewing the pavilion as an object, your view is led to this implied point. So this creates an intellectual puzzle, since a literal 1-point view of this vanishing point looking through the pavilion appears as a 2-point perspective because of the embedded distortion. When you move to this vanishing point, in other words on the other end of the pavilion, and you look back at the pavilion, the side walls and the roof disappear entirely, resulting in an impossibly flat, depthless object. I love this project because it is deceptively simple and because the effect lies less in the object than in the implications regarding the inconsistent visual space of the site around it. The downside of this, of course, is that the project is virtually unpublishable. Triskelion exemplifies vortices. It's a temporary exhibition pavilion which began by thinking about the spatial efficiency of the global system of intermodal freight transport. The site for the pavilion is the Presidio of San Francisco with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge. The structure was to host an exhibition relating to site-specific art in the Presidio before moving on to a new site. And the project brief identified the seemingly conflicting goal of creating a nomadic structure that could be site-specific. And they also identified the use of shipping containers for ease of transport. So the project began with formal research regarding efficiency, kind of like the Conway House, which was, another inquiry into close packing. Shipping containers are highly efficient standardized forms that imply a vast global network of transportation and commerce. When they're grouped at maximum efficiency, they form a tightly packed three-dimensional Cartesian matrix. Inside a standard container array, there is no wasted space. The downside of this spatial economy is a rather constraining architectural envelope. After much research into close packing, we've come to the conclusion that architectural opportunities are often born from judicious inefficiency or wasted space. As such, in our initial design strategy, we considered various inefficient configurations, free from the relentless logic of the grid. The experiment was limited to the arrangement of 3 containers. We decided to combine the organizational paradigms of a star and a simplex into a more complex figure, a triskelion. A triskelion maximizes perimeter surface area, which is good for an exhibition space. It creates an internal void, which makes larger public gatherings possible, and it implies rotation around a local center, along with a star-like axial extension along its 3 extending tips. The rotation is important for us spatially, as we'll discuss, and the overall form because it references the 3-legged triskelion, which is the ancient symbol of eternal movement. Because the Presidio wanted minimal impact on the existing site, the structure was manufactured off-site in 8 weeks. And then it was trucked to location in 4 loads. 3 modified shipping containers and a 4th containing various bits and pieces. It was put together in a week. On site, we aligned its north-facing wing to frame views of the nearby Golden Gate Bridge, and the structure hovers on the site like some sort of spaceship that has touched down. Here you can see the 3 reclaimed shipping containers set at 120-degree angles relative to each other. The residual triangular space created at the center supports a diffuse skylight and acts as an atrium for sculpture display within. Though each container is painted to reflect the local context, a kind of Presidio camouflage. There's regulation Presidio cream, the National Park Service invisible green, and of course the Golden Gate Bridge's international orange. It's the Bay Area contextualism. The entry pulls you in towards the view of the bridge, and experientially the interior space produces a subtle spinning effect, and your view is continually reframed. Stepping back in the central atrium, your sense of balance is set off by an apparent symmetry, but different depths of field. Your vision is split between competing axes. This creates the destabilizing effect of a bifurcated point of view, the experience of always looking awry. This spatial dynamic suggests to us the singularity found at the center of a vortex. Because the site views are framed and pulled into the space, the experiential space of the extended site gets caught up in this turbulence. And in this diagram, a hypothetical field of triskelions and their rotational logics disturb the uniformity of the universal grid. Gaps. This is the South End Rowing Club. It's the oldest swimming and rowing club in San Francisco. This club is located at the Hyde Street Pier with a beach onto Aquatic Park and views of the Golden Gate Bridge and historic ships. We have historic ships too. It's all very quaint, and the members are very hearty because the San Francisco Bay is very cold. The existing clubhouse is a dark, labyrinthine accretion of buildings assembled over the past 100 years, and it's riddled with gaps and misalignments. They just, whenever they needed to build anything, they just would tack it on, and it's pretty ad hoc. So we loved this jumbled surprise of the club, and we decided to extend and thematize this building strategy. The new programs are treated like two floating boxes that are untethered from the existing club and from each other. More important than the blocks, though, are the gaps between them. All the gaps or the residual spaces expand to become a kind of goo that infiltrates the entire building. The gaps become a new leaky spine that organizes the club and also create unexpected visual connections across programs and through the building. So the club is a collection of program blocks that is floating in a sea of circulation and public space. You can see the block programs pulled away here from the leftover space or gaps that are modeled as solid below. The program calls for a new women's locker room, a gym and a deck, and a second boathouse below. This is a view from the pier that shows the current South End Club and its addition, rendered not so much as a single building, as the rather casual accumulation of a number of structures. The new addition extends and thematizes the current language and effect in terms of scale, texture, and spatial arrangement. The gaps, or the leftover space, operate in both plan and section as circulation, and they provide daylight and ventilation, and unexpected cross views within and through the building. The gym and the boathouse open out onto the beach at Aquatic Park. We introduced a new double-height circulation spine into the central fissure of the building. There's a skylight overhead to bring daylight into the otherwise dark interior. The central hanging stair connects locker rooms directly to the water for speedy retreats from the bay and allows views into the new boathouse. Hidden moment frames in the boathouse keep the ceiling clear of intermittent structure. Rowing shells will hang there and be visible from the adjacent Hyde Street Pier through the clear-story gap. It's a touristy area, and we were actually asked by the merchants to show something charming about the club if we had the opportunity. The traditional wooden barges are arrayed, it's all about charm, San Francisco. The traditional wooden barges are arrayed on the floor below, and there are two oversized glass garage doors that open to the cove. This is a view of the upper boathouse looking into the new lower boathouse, and it gives you a sense of some of the density, irregularity, and the liveliness that will be imparted to the new space once the inhabitants take over. Shearing. This is the last within this section. Hyde is a 25,000 square foot adaptive reuse project using shearing among other techniques to contrast historic and contemporary languages. At Hyde, we are converting an existing 1920s cast-in-place concrete parking garage into 7 condominiums, a small retail space, and 14 parking spaces. Formally, the project exposes the rough character of the existing building structure and shell and contrasts it with smooth abstract language of the new insertions. In addition to a complete interior renovation, a new penthouse is being added, which will have panoramic Golden Gate Bridge views. The project imposes a series of linear transformations onto a neutral Cartesian grid, and the grid is really something that is implied by the rational building itself, the way that it's structured. This transformation, which is a 20-degree affine shear, crops up in both plan and section throughout the project. By using this trope in various guises, we wanted to suggest an unresolved tension between two competing spatial ordering systems. And because it's under construction, it's really hard to get a shot of. I'm fearful that the stair, which is something we're so excited about, is going to be just as hard to photograph as Parallax. But this shows the primary stair under construction in a 50-foot tall sheared void. Everything within the void follows the same 20-degree affine shear. The stair and the landings are steel and glass and are capped by a skylight overhead that repeats the sheared structure. And the shearing introduces a dynamic of motion that contrasts with the heavy orthogonal language of the shell. The infrastructure required for the new programs is hidden in stacked abstract boxes, which are organized by layout lines spawned from the existing building. You can see the sheared void of the main stair at the top of the plan. The shearing is again evident here in the elevation at a penthouse unit, here again. And the exposed steel framing of the ceilings in the units below also participates in the sheared paradigm. Inconsistency registers the manipulation of the existing building, creating a collage of competing formal systems. So we've made it through the first half, and before the second half of our lecture, we're going to take a little break, and Luke is going to share a few computational research projects. In general, these projects tend to be more abstract than our architectural projects, but the issues that they explore keep coming up in our built work, so we hope they create grounding for all of the projects.
Thank you, Zoe, and again, it's a pleasure to be here talking to you all. So this is a little break, and in broad terms, the research that we're going to show is really focused on our interest in chance and how chance relates to computational design. And so this slide for us, it's a nearly 100-year-old image of a Duchamp piece which exemplifies the decisive break in the history of aesthetics, with anti-compositional devices like indifference replacing various well-established orthodoxies regarding beauty and order. For this poster, Duchamp took some cubes, put them into a mesh bag, kind of jumbled them up, found a position he liked, photographed it, and then painted it. And so, but in the resulting image, erased the bag. So there's this kind of this idea of indifference, but then the erasure of selection. And so as architects, we must recognize in 2013 the conceptual reverberations of Duchamp's jittered boxes in the world we are living and now designing. So this thread of our work began with a curious project brief from a client, which was to design a habitat for an animal client, specifically a gopher. Not a beaver, but a gopher. So after reading a lot of scientific papers, you can see one on the left here. These are some actual, this is what gophers really live in. We ended up designing a computer program that simulated a burrow network, which is, this is our virtual burrow there on the right. And for us, it was really fascinating. I mean, it was like a whole new world opened up for us because it was a new paradigm of formal generation. It's rule-based, so it's logical, but it's also contingent on the specifics of its own history. Computationally, even in this early two-dimensional project, we were also forced to deal with several, as it turned out, quite deep issues, such as collision detection and self-avoidance. And also, hopefully you can see the relationship. Conceptually, we enjoyed how these burrow networks are close packed. They're trying to be efficient, but they are never perfectly efficient. So there's this kind of structural tension between the desire to be, you want to get to 100%, but you never do. And that's an interesting place for architecture, we think. So having developed a fairly elaborate set of tools in 2D, we switched platforms and applied the same exact logic, but in 3D space, and this time using piped polylines as our base form. And again, we were interested in formal systems that could be close packed. And it was funny because when we started this project, we thought we were going to use this is essentially a behind the scenes look at how we did the thing. And we found that we were most interested in this buffered form as opposed to the idea was to use these buffers and then make spindles, but that this ended up being closer to what we were after sort of intellectually. So we took a break and then came back to this research work in the following year, asking ourselves, how could we introduce style to this? Because the previous two projects, you have agents, but they're essentially going on random walks. So there's no, at any given time step, there is complete freedom. And so how can simulation, computer simulations, have wrist, what we typically think of as a particular style? And we began to focus on the idea of controlling the agents more specifically in terms of behaviors, a fine-grained control of their paths. And so here we see a Bryce Marden painting from his Cold Mountains series, and then this kind of relentless computational dissection of it, dissection of the curves in terms of the angular velocity controls necessary to produce that curve. What was happening behind the scenes, and how could you make a Bryce Marden machine effectively? And so that was the project, I don't even remember, 2010. This idea of these agents, they can move according to this type of paradigm, but then we also introduced the limitation of a cube. So there's also this kind of constraint. So obviously you can tell as this happens over time, you're going to begin to fill space entirely efficiently and close pack it as you go towards infinity. So at a certain point, this was all fine and interesting and great, but we began to get bored with piped polylines. And so that introduced this question of what should our new primitive be? And so we looked towards a tetrahedron, and this was kind of around the time of the Triskelion. And a tetrahedron is interesting because it is, in a way, it's the most efficient way to create a volume. So we had this idea of architecture. We wanted this to be three-dimensional. We don't want something to be inflated after we finish it. So let's start with something which is always already volumetric. And that was like the first step with this project. And the other was the idea of really getting deeper into the idea of polymorphic behavior. And so here you can see, this is like a little snippet of this. This thing has 5 ways it can behave, and you have a color coding of how it has behaved over time. And so essentially, although this doesn't look like much, we were very excited because it looks, if you think of previously the way that people were doing computation, in a sense, things were growing like coral. So you map something happening over time, but there's a kind of a static accretion. It grows, but it never looks back on itself. There's no kind of flexibility. So all of a sudden, you have this idea that with these behaviors, you can also have something that's reactive as it's growing over time, something more like an octopus, something slippery that doesn't have a stable form. That's the goal, at least. An installation proposal using this cloud geometry. Okay, this is the last project in the break, something we're currently developing. And really, it's a development of the tetrahedron idea into a surface. Any arbitrary surface you can take, and you can just basically relax its vertices while subdividing a face at each time step. And so if you think about it, the result isn't the same as crumpling exactly, because if you take a piece of paper, the paper's not going to actually increase in surface area. So it's like, but digitally, you have this opportunity to do something which is essentially a fractal. So you can crumple this surface, and as you go, as time increases, the surface area can become infinite, but the volume can be bounded, which is kind of mind-blowing, but also I think computers haven't quite caught up in terms of processing power. But with cheap memory, I think we're on our way. Okay, back to the architecture portion of the lecture. Relaxation. As Zoe mentioned in her introduction, these are a group of projects which explore the theme of relaxation using various techniques. So the first project, Crumpling, is the theme, and the project is Honighaus. And the project's a renovation of an existing Edwardian house in Pacific Heights, San Francisco. And it's funny preparing this lecture because we realized this was like an analog, 10 years earlier, essentially an analog version of what we're actually working on, this month. So I guess that's how it goes in practice. So here's the story of the project. There's a little Edwardian house here. Kind of like in Alien, there's this little contemporary architecture monster that grows and grows and grows until it pops off the roof. So here's the new penthouse showing the crumpled geometry, which is essentially the trace of this process. This is another shot of the penthouse showing where the alien escaped, which is in a tear above the main stair. Inside the project, the crumpling is more gentle as the logic gets softer as it extends down the stairs to the front door. For the same client during the same project, we have a crumpled water feature in the rear yard, and I should mention that this was actually the first sort of digitally fabricated thing we had ever done. So this was a small piece, but it sort of opened our eyes to the techniques. And sort of anecdotally, I went to check initially, for those of you involved in digital fabrication, I went to check the original mock-up, and they had the original foam fabricator had thrown away our digital file and approximated it by hand, which was it was fascinating, because they were used to doing like gorillas and cornucopias, and so they were like, oh, that was like the intent, and they threw it away. And so it was a very interesting set of discussions that resulted. For the same project, some concrete tetrastars we developed for a little fire pit in the rear yard. These are all about like 5-inch radius. And we were interested in how these forms interlock. The strength of, these are forms that are used as coastal breakwater systems at a much larger scale. And, in California, there are a bunch of places that use these. And so it's funny because at the time we actually developed this project as we had these analog models floating around the office, and we also had a bunch of digital models of the same thing. And the world may have changed in the past few years. I don't know. I haven't done this exercise. But at the time, there really was no readily available simulation engines which could model the physical behavior of even like 5 of these things with anything like reasonably tight tolerances. I mean, it was enough for like a first-person shooter, but if you actually looked at the geometry, things were like, half intersecting, and it was just nasty. And so it's funny because it was this whole thing of like, in real life, it's fairly trivial once you have these things to like push them around, do Champ style, but the fact that you just can't do it on the computer and that you're suddenly constrained to a certain type of geometric system was like super troubling, because we assumed, of course, when we started it would be trivial. So, but again, you should note this is another sort of variant of the the recurring obsession with close packing and inefficiency. But here also there's, you know, the kind of the geometric, the idea of the orientations that are free. Softness. This is the Gallery House in San Francisco, and it's a combination art gallery and house south of Market in San Francisco. And the project interior, the interior is really mostly very strict, rational, and orthogonal. And contrasting to this are several elements which explore soft geometry. The house itself is on South Park. This is a site plan showing South Park. And again, another Roman circus. This is a great pairing for the lecture series. It's the only Roman circus-shaped park in San Francisco, and it's very unique. It's a very dense kind of urban area, and immediately this context suggested the theme of a soft edge to us as this ambiguous boundary between the hard urban grid of the city and the figural void of the park. And this is our project. This is the Bay Bridge here. Heavy dose of realism here, the planning code. A little fragment of San Francisco planning code, at least, and it's the law. Like, why is San Francisco? Zoe talked about I mean, San Francisco really is charming. It's a joke, but it also really is charming. And this is part of the reason, because the law builds in charm in the form of an allowable envelope. So you are highly incentivized to fill this envelope because it adds value to your, you know, to what you can build. And it's essentially an envelope setback exception, encouraging bay windows. So our approach was to take the planning code quite literally, maybe like a mathematician would, as opposed to an architect, which was to come at it not with any sort of aesthetic agenda or belief structure or even maybe knowledge of history, but to just say, what does it imply mathematically? And the trick was to it never states that the section has to be continuous. The section is completely free. And so this was like part of a taxonomy of legal bay windows in San Francisco. And so we kind of went through this with the client. They chose the one we circled. And from that analysis, we developed essentially this blanket here, this legal blanket, which moves around in section. And then onto that, we projected a bunch of sort of buffered locators, these locators that have a certain distance from each other in space. And then we triangulated it using an algorithm developed by the mathematician Boris Delaunay in 1934. And it's commonly used essentially in computational geometry to describe irregular organic surfaces. And this was a great project for us. Clients one is a scientist, the other a mathematician. And so it was awesome to be able to have like nostalgia for this dude in 1934, you know, figuring this thing out. And the idea that you know, it's funny because math is so abstract, and the whole idea of math, which is its beauty, is that pure math is not applied, right? It's just totally like these guys just think, and women think of this stuff. And so it was funny to us that ultimately, because we went through like, you know, 1,000 options for this, that the efficiency of this kind of tessellation ultimately to us had the most beauty, because it seemed free, it seemed organic, but it's also underlying it. If you unpack it, it is as relentlessly efficient as any, you know, it's an even more efficient way of sort of partitioning space than many other paradigms. So that this idea that you can have an organic logic that also implies that somehow does both of those was great. The facade lattice from the park. And as I said, it was important to us to create an ambiguous zone between the strictly orthogonal geometry of the house and the looser park morphology. And so in all locations, the zone is large enough to occupy a very pensive figure in that ambiguous zone, lost in the ambiguity. The master bedroom, which feels kind of like a tree house when you have the doors open. And here you get a sense of this contrast between the hard, heavy geometry of the house and the interior volumes and the softer facade. And so real quick, a few shots showing the project interior, where we emphasized a kind of a figure void ambiguity. And we really were interested in this kind of Roman feeling of heaviness. This is the ground floor gallery, a view of the house from the front door, some thick interior chunks, no walls. Well, there's one wall in the house, but everything else is this very thick mass. The living room. Okay, so now pay attention to the chunk in the middle, this guy. Inside, in the very center of the house, we designed this sink, which was modeled after a human navel. And so the idea is that you have this orthogonal container But then here at the very, very middle, where you're most protected, you have this thing which kind of bulges and sags. And we were really interested in this moment, which it turned out was illegal or vaguely illegal, which was a problem. But it's this idea of hidden space, this undercut space where you can't see it, and that you break from the modernist paradigm of seeing everything, and that transparency is good, right? Hidden space. As a process drawing for some roof pavers we did, which shows the kind of dual relationship of the Delaunay tessellation and the Voronoi diagram, but more importantly, you see this kind of like hex and digrid, very sort of rational ordered, and the idea that it kind of drifts into disorder, and that this space where you have a trace of the order, but you're drifting away from it, I think is exciting. It's this kind of mathematical organic moment. The pavers in context. An unbuilt design for a privacy screen in the rear yard, which was loosely based on Borromini's star piles at Santivo alla Sapienza. All roads lead to Rome, indeed. Okay, Slumping. This is a single family house in Orinda, California, where we really focused on developing a relaxed site-specific geometry. So the story is we essentially designed a perfect house in orthogonal space, but then we just let this thing kind of slump and twist onto the specific site. And the story that we told ourselves was that this resulted in this kind of internal tear. So we have the perfection of the internal relationships, but there's also this kind of sagginess or droopiness. This is the design model. The digital model in context, the project really opens up to some views of the Berkeley Hills. And internally, I should say, the house forms a continuous looping circuit of uninterrupted circulation. The master bedroom terrace to the roof, the same space from the inside, and then the living room. Okay, informality. This is a Parklet in San Francisco. It's in the Tenderloin, and it's for a small restaurant called Farm Table, and it is essentially, it replaces 2 automobile spots with what we like to think of as an abstract chunk of nature. Happy users, you can see them. And so the Tenderloin is arguably the densest, most New York-like part of San Francisco. And so in this context, we really wanted our Parklet to be a landscape-like form that is casual and non-prescriptive regarding use. The design process for this was entirely computational, applying the polymorphic behavior ideas developed in the branch and tetrahedron cloud projects to a concentric growth scenario. So this is a false color diagram highlighting the time steps. There's 2 places, basically 2 growth centers, and it's sort of 2 radial growth patterns that the red is the beginning and the blue is the end. And so here, hopefully, is the raw output from the simulation. So as this thing goes, you'll note in particular the overlap detection and the subsequent self-healing, which looks innocent, as many things do, in retrospect, but was horribly nasty in terms of the number of degenerate cases we were forced to consider. So, importantly, I think that this moment in this project points to one aspect of the next wave of computational design. Many of our current design tools are fundamentally structured by clean circuits of information, which can handle and map extremely complex relationships between sets, but tend to break down or resist inconsistent behavior. Of course, the irony in this, speaking of inconsistency, I've lost the mouse. The irony in this is that in many respects, this is simply the application of the modernist principle of transparency to the computer. Seeing the connections in the process, think of Grasshopper, is generally considered to be a good thing. Perhaps it's the influence of Tony Vidler, but Zoe and I have always been a little suspicious of the redemptive power of such transparency, and believe that really interesting architecture is always a little murky, maybe even to its author. So for us, the open-ended question is how to use the computer in a different way, how to successfully implement a messier process behind the scenes, but one that still compiles. So in this project, the specific geometry results from a consideration of various body positions, seating, perching, and reclining. So our behaviors embed slope ranges and form appropriate for these uses. Against this variable behavior, the specific geometry is held consistent, a triangular mesh that allows midpoint vertices. And so we're generally really interested in this type of narrative tension between constraint and freedom. The finished project from above. Historians in the crowd will note our use of Beaux-Arts red to indicate the section cut. And we were really interested in a form that would not just look relaxed, but actually encourage people to relax. So rather than a raft with cafe tables, our parklet allows, people, you can sit on it, you can perch on it, you can lie down. And that's the idea, that there isn't necessarily, and there's not it's not driven by program, it's actually driven by occupation, like how the body would occupy the space. This is a detail of the primary opening across from Farm Table Cafe's main window, and finally a view from inside the cafe. This is a quick view of a work in progress, a roof deck which explores similar themes currently under construction, a plan of its mesh. Drifting. This project is a weekend house on the Monterey Bay that we call Dune. The specific site is a beautiful site, the bay on one side, farmlands on the other, and this kind of really actually a great housing development from the 70s. What has happened to America? So the project is deeply embedded in its context of coastal sand dunes, and the sands drift over and around it. Essentially, the house is a synthetic dune, its tilting floors and roof constrained by the angle of repose of the local sand drifts. The design process uses the same basic strategy as the parklet, concentric growth structured by agent paths. This is another false color diagram showing the growth at various time steps. But whereas the parklet is a single surface, Dune controls two surfaces at the same time, the roof and the floor, instead of just one. So there's a kind of a loose horizontal mirroring, which we control between the two surfaces, and this is made explicit in the very core, where the two surfaces meet, in a kind of involution, and at the edge where they meet in various complex ways. And so also like the parklet, the agent motion is controlled by something called quaternion rotations. And so this approach arose from what we originally thought. These stories keep being the same. We thought it was a very modest desire, right? We want to move an agent through space, keeping track of what is up for the agent as they move through space. And as it turned out, trying to do this using Cartesian coordinates is actually nearly impossible. But it's trivial using quaternion geometry once the system is properly set up. So you just have to find someone from MIT, essentially, to help you. So as the issue unfolded, we were actually quite surprised and reminded the extent to which all of us, our design logics are inextricably tied up with established methods. So we learn how to do something and then we sort of keep doing it that way. And so how changing tools and sort of at the deeper the level that you change the tool, the more the project's kind of, the more it will fundamentally alter the design space. And that's for the simple reason that what you can do easily when you're designing in a specific context is the most likely outcome. So in a sense, I mean, the argument about tool sets has to do with, it's not just making things possible, it's actually about making things easy and comfortable ergonomically. This is the structural frame that resulted from that simulation. View from the beach. So you can see the angle of the living room edge matching the adjacent dune, creating this interior-exterior continuity. And here, this is that central connection I was talking about. So the initial seed for the project is essentially those triangles, and it grows out, and then it involutes into itself in this kind of this horizontal mirroring. Main living space. Okay. This is the final project. This is a new house in Reno, Nevada. It's a work in progress, currently in design development, and we are becoming licensed in Nevada, which is also very exciting for us because we're going to go to Vegas eventually. I know it. I can feel it. But so the first of two study models.
You have to go to Vegas if you're in Reno.
That's true. We are already going to Reno. So yes, Reno and Vegas. This is the first of two study models. This is from the street side, and so in a way for us, this is a funny project because it's not purely computational, although there are elements of sort of some of the mesh obsessions, and I would say in a weird way it's actually most related to parallax conceptually, because we're really trying to make this a virtual object, essentially the result of some type of stretched spatial field which distorts and extends the mass of the house up and out towards a panoramic view, and maybe also sort of complementary squishes it down in certain parts. And so this is the second of our study models, and this is seen from the view side of the project. And this is a current design development model. And so currently, towards the street, the house appears fairly simple, orthogonal bar pure, but as it reaches out towards the view, the geometry twists and stretches, rising up to create a main living space below. The final image, a view back to the house from the view side. And so through the glass of the living room here, no more pointer, okay. You can see the courtyard, which we're developing as a synthetic landscape. And so this is a funny, I think, and sort of one of the questions that Anne asked us this afternoon actually provoked this kind of startling realization, which is actually, so it's unlike Dune, which is so much about the context and the embedding in the context and sort of reacting to the site, that in a sense, this is a fairly flat lot. I think there's like a 3-foot drop towards the view, but that here we have this kind of opportunity to literally create a synthetic landscape, but that is not necessarily, it's not contextual, it's within this kind of internal zone. So I think sort of, it's a provocative open question for us how to create such a thing from scratch to create this new topography, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, that was a quick snapshot of our current interests, and I again want to thank the League for their invitation to present. This has been a really valuable opportunity for Zoe and I to get some distance from the day-to-day demands of practice. I think we all know what we're talking about, and consider our work from a broader perspective. Thank you.